To start out the history of DC Comics, we must go back to January 7th, 1890. A boy named Malcom Wheeler-Nicholson was born in Greenville, Tennessee. Malcom would move with his mother to New York City and eventually join the military academy. By 1917, he was a part of the U.S. Cavalry, and it seemed as if his military career was about to take off. But unfortunately, his military career at its infancy unraveled. He began to have problems with senior officers, which led to countercharges, hearings, and a lawsuit. This was enough to dead-end his career, but the military also almost dead-ended his life. See, in 1922, Malcom, he was a victim of a shooting that his family called an army-sanctioned assassination attempt. The assassination attempt not only risked the future of Malcom's life, but also the future of what we now call DC Comics. After Malcom's military career was over, he began to truly devote his purpose to writing. See, he was already writing short stories in the early 1920s, but it wasn't until 1925 that he founded Wheeler-Nicholson's Inc. This business would thrive for 10 years, but after those years, Malcom, he decided to think bigger. Around 1935, inspired by the famous Funnies magazines, Malcom decided to form a comics publishing company called National Allied Publications. Before this company was formed, though, comic strips consisted only of adaptations of popular stories. For example, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island. Malcom, he didn't own any of the rights to these comic strips because it wasn't his original material. But National Allied Publications would change that. Finally, Malcom would be able to publish his own original material, starting with New Fun #1, an anthology comic that consisted of humor and adventure stories. The book, it sold well enough, and not too long after, Malcom, he would begin publishing comics at a consistent rate. But unfortunately, Malcom would be in a consistent financial crisis as well. For 2 to 3 years, Malcom was holding on to his comic publishing company by a thread, but he stuck it out long enough for Detective Comics #1 to be published in 1937. Detective Comics, it would sell incredibly well, and eventually National Allied Publications would change to Detective Comics Inc., aka DC Inc. DC would soon publish a new anthology comic called Action Comics. Comic creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster would create the very first superhero, Superman. Action Comics was a sales hit, and it brought in a new age of comic books. The cover of Superman holding the car above his head still remains the most expensive and iconic cover of all time. But a runner-up has to go to Detective Comics #27, which would be published in 1939, roughly a year after Superman's debuts. See, comic creators Bob Kane and Bill Finger would debut the Caped Crusader, known as Batman. At this point, the public was requesting more superhero comics, especially since they were a great escape from the impending worry of war that would erupt later on. Only 6 months after the release of Detective Comics #27, World War II would begin, and the world would be stuck in one of the darkest times in history for 6 years. During these 6 years, comics would rise to new heights, and many of DC's notable characters would debut. By 1940, the first DC logo would debut with the title A DC Publication. This title and logo would change slightly in 1942 to a Superman DC Publication. As you can tell, Superman was an important hero at this time. Both the Man of Steel and the Dark Knight would become symbols of hope and justice in a time of war. Other heroes such as Zatara, the Crimson Avenger, Wesley Dodds, Sandman, Red Tornado, Wonder Woman, Jay Garrick the Flash, Captain Marvel, Hawkman, Johnny Thunder, the Spectre, Green Arrow, Hourman, Dr. Fate, Alan Scott the Green Lantern, the Atom, and Batgirl would lead the charge into the golden age of comics. But Batman, he would get his own title in 1940, and he would be assisted by comics' first sidekick, Robin. He would also go up against iconic villain, the Joker. Other villains during this time were Ultra Humanite, the Mad Monk, Hugo Strange, Dr. Sivana, Lex Luthor, Catwoman, Tony Zuko, Clayface, Scarecrow, Ares, Two-Face, Prankster, The Shade, Ragdoll, Mr. Mind, Toyman, Cheetah, The Thinker, Vandal Savage, Mr. Mixia Spitlick, Solomon Grundy, and Black Adam. Now, besides all these heroes and villains, the core of the Golden Age centered on the team, the first super team in comics known as the Justice Society of America. During the Golden Age, comic creators Sheldon Moldoff and Gardner Fox focused on building the world of DC with these heroes, and the Justice Society, they led the charge. While this was going on, Bob Kane, Bill Finger, Joe Shuster, and Jerry Siegel focused on building the two pillars of DC, the world's finest, Batman and Superman. Superman would even be featured in his own animated cartoon titled The Mad Scientist, which was produced by Fletcher Studios. This cartoon would be released in theaters on September 26, 1941. There would be 17 total animated short films released, and all of them had incredible animation for its time. Superman would remain the core of DC for many years to come, being featured on the name until 1972. The Man of Steel will be a guide of hope in a rough decade that was the 40s, and DC really used the character's symbolism to its full effect. See, DC was doing well in the 40s, and the golden age of comics inspired many young Americans and people from all walks of life. But then came a new era, one that would later be called the Silver Age. In the mid-1950s, the popularity of superhero comics suddenly dipped, and all that remained popular at DC was Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. The Trinity stood strong in hard financial times, but DC wasn't going to give up on all of its other heroes, so editor-director Julius Schwartz decided to make a big change. He decided, alongside other workers at DC, to revamp a lot of their heroes. For example, Barry Allen the Flash would finally make his debut. Hal Jordan the Green Lantern would also make his debut. Many other heroes would be revamped, such as Red Tornado, Zatanna, Blue Beetle, the Atom, Batgirl, Hawkman, and even Batman and Superman. All these revamps herald a new age for comics, and new families were attached to certain heroes. The Superman family and the Bat family both began, and this was big because, as you guys know, both of these families would hold strong for decades to come. During this time, Superman, he became stronger than his Golden Age self, and Batman, he swung deeper into his world's greatest detective self. By the 1950s, DC finally had a shared continuity between the Golden Age and Silver Age, which was called the DC Universe. This DC Universe would then expand to a DC multiverse in the iconic Flash of Two Worlds comic, which would come out in 1961. 1961 was overall just a big year for DC because not only was the DC multiverse introduced, but also the Justice League of America. The Brave and the Bold, number 28, would see the Justice League face off against Starro and plant their team in the history books. DC was thriving once again, with all of its heroes in sustainable popularity by 1966. New writers Daniel O'Neil, Neil Adams, and many more kept the great services of DC going. But with the comics thriving, it was finally time for DC to put great focus into the television realm with Batman 66. This wasn't the first time a DC property was put into live action. See, before Batman 66, Superman actually had 3 live action projects. In 1948, Superman, played by Kirk Allen, was released, and in 1950 and 1951, George Reeves starred as the Man of Steel in Atom Man vs. Superman and Superman and the Mole Men. These projects were somewhat successful, but not the level of Batman 66. Adam West, he would star as the campy Batman in a show that was actually supposed to fail, but thankfully it succeeded and pushed Batman's popularity to an even higher status. Both Batman and Superman were at even playing fields as the pillars of DC. Finally though, in 1972, DC officially adopted its first logo without Superman in the name, officially recognizing that the DC Universe was finally a staple in not only the comic book community, but the entire world. The Silver Age of comics was one that focused heavily on science fiction. It was very wacky and fun, but that theme would change and comics would adopt darker themes, especially DC Comics, as the company would head into the Bronze Age. Now, going into the Bronze Age, we have the arrival of one of the most influential creators in the entirety of comics history. This creator being Jack Kirby, who would create the New Gods, and he would also create Kamandi and Etrigan the Demon. Now, the New Gods, they would take up an important corner of the DC Universe for decades to come. See, besides the arrival of Jack Kirby, this is also the age where DC officially adopted the name DC Comics. Yep, DC, Detective Comics, was no longer that. It was now Detective Comics. Interesting. But what makes the Bronze Age stand out is how DC Comics changes from a more fun fantasy tone to a more naturalistic and darker tone. This is the age when Superman gets infected by the Black Mercy and lives in a delusional fake world that eventually gets destroyed. This is the age when Alan Scott the Green Lantern and the JSA are forced to kill Japanese soldiers in a dark World War II illusion. This is the age when Hal Jordan the Green Lantern and Green Arrow would find Roy Harper injecting drugs into his system. This is the age when both Flash and Supergirl would die, sacrificing themselves for the entire multiverse. But that's at the end of the Bronze Age. Before we get to DC's first crisis, there are a few notable projects that must be mentioned that happened in the 1970s and the early 80s. The first being The New Adventures of Superman, which was a sequel to the Adventures of Superman animated show that came out in the 50s. Speaking of more animated content, we had the Adventures of Superboy, the Superman Aquaman Hour of Adventure, Aquaman, the Batman Superman Hour, and most of all, Super Friends. But what about live action shows? Well, there was one major one in the 70s, which was Linda Carter's Wonder Woman. This was a show that became quite popular in the mid-70s and actually put out a TV movie called The New Original Wonder Woman. Nothing would exceed Wonder Woman's popularity until the release of the first Superman movie in 1978. This was the beginning of the Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve era, one of the best superhero movies of all time, and it would have an awesome sequel in 1980. But unfortunately, the OG Superman movies would plummet in quality after the second movie, resulting in the third and especially the fourth being utter disasters. Also, I can't forget the Supergirl and Swamp Thing standalone movies that were not well regarded. Overall, Superman and Wonder Woman both shined in the live action scene, with two legendary actors playing their superhero roles, but the time for a cinematic Batman would soon be near. However, before we get into the next age, we must talk about the events that pushed DC and all of comics into that next age, and events that finally simplified a multiverse of continuity into one prime Earth. A crossover of epic proportions and great artwork, this event obviously being Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis has three big moments: the death of the Flash, the death of Supergirl, and Earth 2 Superman punching the Anti-Monitor. These moments led to the first huge reboot in comics, this reboot being the post-Crisis DC era, era which would stand alongside the beginning of the modern era that most people know today. Before we get to the modern era, I want to say I think a lot of people love Crisis on Infinite Earths because of the idea of it. The idea of all these heroes crossing over, but the actual story is not really profound or even compelling if you read it again. And if you look at the two adaptations, both adaptations, the Arrowverse and the Tomorrowverse that would eventually come out later on in DC's history, both of them, the best parts about them are the crossover elements, not really the story. But as we go into the modern era, I must say I'm excited to talk about this era, this next one, because it includes Dark Knight Returns and Batman: The Killing Joke. Both amazing comics and, in my opinion, some of the best of all time. Starting with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, that is the comic book that would usher in the next age of DC Comics, the Dark Age. The Dark Age of DC Comics would consist of more darker themes and more graphic violence and a cynical tone. See, besides Frank Miller's futuristic hulking Batman and Batman Year One, DC would also publish other dark Batman comics like Batman: The Cult, Batman: The Killing Joke, Batman: A Lonely Place of Dying, Batman: Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, and most of all, Batman: Death in the Family. All of these stories were published within a span of 3 years from 1986 to 1988. This was the post-crisis era, where not only Batman was in the spotlight, but also Superman, Wonder Woman, Swamp Thing, the Suicide Squad, and the Watchmen. The Watchmen series was groundbreaking in the mid-80s, and it fit in line with DC's darker approach. This darker approach showcased heavily through Frank Miller's Batman, which would inspire DC to take a darker approach for their next live-action Batman. No longer would Batman be campy like Adam West. Instead, we would get a more darker and grittier Tim Burton Batman in 1989, played by none other than Michael Keaton. This Batman would generate a lot of hype for Batman across the world. This gritty Batman wouldn't last long though, because after Tim Burton's Batman Returns, DC would revert back to a campy Batman for Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. It still seemed like DC had a problem dedicating itself to a certain version of Batman. Should he be campy or should he be grounded? Well, we'll see how they solve this problem later on, but whereas the movies reverted back to a campy style with movies such as Steel, Justice League of America, and of course Batman and Robin, the comics did not. See, the comic corner of the DC universe stuck to its new dark age, and they actually doubled down in the 90s. Batman was really the only super dark part of DC post-crisis universe in the late 80s, but that would change by the mid-90s with a lot of death and evil superheroes. For example, in 1994, we had Hal Jordan Green Lantern turn evil in the Emerald Twilight Saga. We also had Batman get his back broken by Bane in the Nightfall Saga. We would then have the DC Universe fall into a dark future with Kingdom Come. But the most pivotal storyline that really emphasized the Dark Age was the death of Superman. A storyline that shocked the entire DC fanbase, but then, just as things seemed very bleak for the DC Universe, Superman, he returned. In the iconic Reign of Superman storyline, it would take a while before Superman would fully recover and become his normal self again. It would take most of the 90s before a comic called Superman for All Seasons came out. This comic, along with Batman: The Long Halloween, ended the DC Dark Age and the 90s on a high note. DC Comics and movies would change a lot going to the 2000s. The live-action TV shows would change a visualized well, because in the 90s, all DC fans had for live-action TV shows were Lois and Clark and John Wesley Shipp's The Flash. Both shows were of solid quality and have good fan bases, but in terms of ratings, they didn't do that well. In the 90s, it seemed like DC need more balance and more direction in a majority of their projects, but there was one corner of DC that was highly successful. That corner was animation. In 1992, Batman the Animated Series began the DCAU, and it was a huge success. BTAS would eventually get a sequel series titled The New Batman Adventures, and eventually a futuristic series titled Batman Beyond. Batman Beyond would become a fan favorite, all while the rest of the DCAU was building into something great. We had the amazing Superman the Animated Series, the beloved Static Shock, and the Zeta Project. During this time, we also had great animated films such as Mask of the Phantasm, Sub-Zero, Mystery of the Batwoman, and my favorite, Return of the Joker. Safe to say, the DCAU was the core of DC in the 90s, and going into the 2000s, the DCAU would only get better. It would reach its full potential, and honestly, DC as a whole, in my opinion, reached its utmost potential in this age. This age being the early modern age. To start it off, in 2001, we had the premiere of an iconic DC live-action show called Smallville. This was a Superman show for a new generation, and it really carried on the legacy of Christopher Reeves as well. Christopher Reeves' legacy would also be carried on even further in Superman Returns, a rough but not terrible film. Smallville would bring in an enormous fan base and put Superman in the spotlight. But don't worry, Superman was not the only world's finest member to get solid treatment. See, Batman, he would as well, as The Dark Knight would star in one of the best superhero and film trilogies of all time. Batman Begins would finally commit to a grounded Batman, and the DC fan base loved it. The Dark Knight trilogy would reach a new high point for the comic book genre with its second movie titled The Dark Knight. This movie brought in all sorts of fans, and Batman's name would grow to a legendary level. Besides the live-action TV shows and great movies, the real selling point of this DC era was the animation once again. See, the DCAU would start out the 2000s with a bang by debuting a Justice League animated series. This series would be great, and it would receive a sequel series that is considered one of the best animated shows of all time, Justice League Unlimited. Justice League Unlimited would end the DCAU in epic fashion, and to make things even better for DC Animation, while the DCAU focused on one epic super team, us fans were treated to another awesome super team. This super team obviously being the Teen Titans. See, the Teen Titans would star in a show that still holds the legendary status to this day. Now, if two great Justice League animated series and awesome Teen Titans series wasn't enough, we also received two phenomenal Batman animated shows titled The Batman and Batman the Brave and the Bold. And Batman the Brave and the Bold is actually my personal childhood Batman show. It is so much fun. It pulls from the Silver Age. I highly recommend it if you've never watched it. Speaking of Batman, the Arkham franchise would begin in the gaming corner of the DC universe. Fans would enjoy the great game that is Arkham Asylum and the masterpiece that is Arkham City. Overall, the DC early modern era was very simple, yet effective, and it holds up very strongly to this day, especially in the comic books. During this period, we had two big crises titled Infinite Crisis with Superboy Prime and Final Crisis with Darkseid. We also had interesting Batman stories, to name a few: Batman No Man's Land, Batman Hush, Gotham Central, Under the Red Hood, and Grant Morrison's Batman. We also had some stellar Superman stories such such as Birthright, Red Son, and All-Star Superman. But really, the best DC comics of this period have to go to DC The New Frontier by Darwin Cook, JLA Tower of Babel, and most of all, DC Universe 52. Guys, DC Universe 52, a comic that spread across 1 year, 52 weeks, a comic every week, written by Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, Greg Rucka, and Mark Waid, was incredible. It was so interesting, just the premise of DC's most popular heroes, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, disappearing, and the stories focusing on more obscure heroes like Booster Gold, even more obscure villains at the time, like Black Adam. It was so good. Some of the best stories are in those 52 weeks of comics. I highly recommend it. Another one that I did mention, The New Frontier. Like, if you have not read DC The New Frontier, then you are so missing out, bro. Like, that is such a great comic. And I mentioned at the beginning of this video how I think James Gunn needs to go back to the roots of DC to really succeed. And if I was him for a Justice League movie down the line, I would adapt The New Frontier, because that is the epitome of what DC is all about. But guys, besides The New Frontier and 52, which are amazing, it's now time to mention one other big addition for this decade of DC, and that addition is the DC original animated films. See, after the end of the DCAU, DC decided to release new DC animated standalone films that adapted iconic stories and some recent great ones at the time. These films, for example, would be Superman Doomsday, Justice League The New Frontier, Batman Gotham Knights, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern First Flight, Superman Batman, Public Enemies and Apocalypse, Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, Batman Under the Red Hood, which is one of the best DC animated films of all time, All-Star Superman, Green Lantern Emerald Knights was also there, Batman Year One, Justice League Doom, Superman vs. the Elite, which is really cool, highly recommend, Batman The Dark Knight Returns Part 1 and 2, and last but not least, Superman Unbound. This lineup of DC original films would end around 2013, and a new and more modern DC animated universe would begin. But we'll talk about that, as well as the DCEU and the Arrowverse, as we go into the most recent DC modern age. This modern era that ran from 2011 to this year, 2024, had the potential to be the best DC age yet, but it ended up having a few problems. See, DC as a whole was very separated during this time. There wasn't a lot of synergy. And besides going back to the roots of DC, I also think James Gunn needs that synergy. And that's one promising thing that I saw at San Diego Comic-Con this year, is that James Gunn's DC Universe, that logo will be on everything. Comics, gaming, movies, TV shows, animation alike, which, if that doesn't say synergy, I don't know what does. But in the past era, in 2011 to 2024, that synergy was not really there at all. For the TV corner, after the end of Smallville in 2011, DC, or more the CW, need a new superhero show to keep DC fans on their channel. This show ended up being Arrow in 2012, a show that would kick off a whole interconnected TV universe called the Arrowverse. This Arrowverse would include shows like The Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, Constantine, Black Lightning, and Batwoman. The Arrowverse would thrive from 2012 to 2019, but after the end of the final Crisis crossover and the series finale of Arrow, the entire TV universe would unravel. The Arrowverse would slowly crumble from 2020 to 2023, where it would finally end with the Flash finale. Now, there is a show that came out of this that is still on, this show being Superman and Lois, which was originally supposed to be a spin-off of Supergirl and be a part of the Arrowverse, Universe, but it was finally revealed that Superman Lois is on its own world, in its own universe. It's not connected to the Arrowverse, and we found out about that in the season 2 finale. Now, Superman Lois is airing its 4th and final season this year. This season looks epic. Did you see that sneak peek of the fight between Doomsday and Superman? Like, it was so cool. Also, the official poster that they released for this final season is so well done. I think that's the best poster I've seen for the show, and maybe the entire Arrowverse. It's definitely up there, and yeah, I'm hyped, man. I'm doing reactions for that final season on this channel, so stay tuned for that. But besides all of that, what's really special about this final season for Superman Lois is that it'll end CW's 23-year-long DC history with the same character. They began with Superman as a teenager in Smallville back in 2001, and we, as fans, will watch them end with Superman once again as a father now, with a family in 2024. This will definitely be an epic ending to a legacy that CW will leave behind. But moving on, let's talk about DC animation. Nope, not the movies, the TV shows. See, in 2012, DC debuted DC Nation, a block on Cartoon Network that aired shows like Green Lantern, the animated series, Justice League Action, Beware the Batman, and most of all, Young Justice. See, after DC Nation though, DC Comics would not have animated shows for a while. For the next 5 to 10 years, all we would get would be Teen Titans Go and Harley Quinn, two vastly different shows. But finally, in 2023, we will get a new Superman animated series after 23 years called My Adventures with Superman, which is awesome so far. And to make matters even better, we are getting a new Batman animated show after 10 years of absence. This show obviously being Batman Caped Crusader. But whereas the animated shows had a big hiatus for a while, the animated movies did not. Through the course of 10 years, we had two interconnected animated film universes, the DC Extended Universe and the Tomorrowverse. The Tomorrowverse would end with Crisis on Infinite Earths, signaling a new age to come, the same way that Flashpoint Paradox signaled a new age back in 2013. Speaking of the Flashpoint Paradox, that storyline would usher in an all-new age for the comic corner of the DC Universe in 2011. The Flashpoint Paradox would reboot the DC Universe into what's now known as the New 52, a line-wide reboot that helped get many new readers into DC Comics. But this reboot did not last forever, as eventually DC fans wanted their classic versions of their heroes back. These classic versions would essentially return in the follow-up line-wide reboot called DC Rebirth, which would begin in 2016. From here, the comic corner of the DC Universe would thrive. For about 3 to 4 years, we would enjoy an awesome event called Dark Knight's Metal, and we would live through a great Justice League run by Scott Snyder. But things would begin to get complicated and messy when the Dark Knight's Metal sequel, Death Metal, released in 2019. After Death Metal, from 2020 to, unfortunately, the present day, DC Comics would struggle to keep comic sales up. They would go through 2 soft reboots called Infinite Frontier and Dawn of DC. They would also go through a very mediocre event called Dark Crisis. Fortunately though, it looks like DC Comics is possibly finding its footing again with its all-new initiative titled All In, an initiative that promises 2 universes, one for classic fans and one for new readers who want to see something different. It also promises more team books in the form of Titans, New Gods, JSA, and most of all, Justice League Unlimited. Yep, awesome title if you ask me. Now, before I cover the DCEU, I want to mention the gaming corner of the DC Universe one more time. See, DC pushed out some awesome games, the most notable ones being the ones a part of the Arkham franchise. No, not you, Suicide Squad. But besides the phenomenal Arkham franchise, we also received the Injustice games, which were fun fighting games that sold really well. Hopefully we see Injustice 3 someday. Like, I gotta see how Batman and Supergirl are going to take down Superman and Brainiac in that alternate dark universe. Like, there's so much story potential there. Like, bro, Injustice 3, it has to happen, right? We'll see though, but for now, we're just hoping that James Gunn can bring back the glory that DC Gaming once had. But first, James Gunn, he has to fix the movie corner of the DC Universe because man, oh man, did the DCAU hurt DC's record in the film department. The DCAU is the epitome of wasted potential. There was so much potential after the first film, Man of Steel, which came out in 2013, but after that film, it was just a mixed bag for 10 years. We had great movies like Wonder Woman, Shazam, Aquaman, and more, but we also had some truly disappointing movies like Wonder Woman 1984, Shazam 2, Aquaman 2, Black Adam, The Flash, and worst of all, Joss Whedon's Justice League film. That was terrible. Luckily, we're out of the DCEU and we're heading to a bright new future with the DCU, hopefully. And we also have the Batman Elseworld universe. Like, that was the one film during the 2020 to 2024 period that really stuck out to me. The Batman, it was just a masterpiece. It was great. I'm excited for the Penguin, and I'm also really excited for the Batman Part 2. Now that's official, that's not getting canceled, we can look forward to that. We could also look forward to the DCU, which is kicking off with an animated show titled Creature Commandos, which has some great potential, I'll say that. We also have a lot of other movies and TV shows that are part of James Gunn's Gods and Monsters Chapter 1 lineup, like Lanterns, Booster Gold, Blue Beetle, Paradise Lost, and more. It seems like we are finally going back to the roots of DC with not only the iconic, long-lasting logo, but also the return of a more classic and heroic Superman. The first hero at DC is finally back in all of his glory, and it's really coming down to him to save DC. James Gunn's Superman is really the decider on whether the next 10 years of DC will be good or another failure. Will this new age deliver? Well, I hope so. But for this DCU to deliver, James Gunn just needs to stick to the hero's core themes of justice, hope, truth, and compassion. Heroes are meant to inspire us and bring in different fans from many generations, old and new alike. DC, that company has been a major player in shaping the world we live in since 1937 and inspiring so many people, and it all began with Superman. So now, in an age when the world and the movie industry both need it most, Superman needs to return and bring back hope to not only the DC fandom, but the comic industry as a whole. But yeah, guys, that's going to wrap up the video. That was a lot of research and a lot of editing. Shout out Prepper, they helped me out with this video. They did a great job. I did not have the time to edit this all by myself, so I got some help. I hope you enjoyed just the pacing of the video and just all the insight, you know? I love DC. I try to put all my passion into these videos. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching and peace out.